The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a sterile quiet pressing down on everyone seated inside. The benches were filled, yet the air felt empty, hollowed out by tension. At the defense table sat Marianne Lewis, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers locked together as if they might drift away if she loosened her grip. She wore no jewellery, no bright colours, just a simple sweater and dark pants. Not because her lawyer told her to dress that way, but because she wanted nothing about her appearance to distract from the truth she carried. Across the room, whispers moved like a low current. Some people leaned toward each other, eyes flicking briefly in her direction before darting away again. Others stared openly, curiosity edged with judgment. Marianne had felt that look her entire life, the look that decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. At the front of the courtroom, the prosecutor adjusted his papers with deliberate slowness. He was calm, confident, the kind of man who had never had to question whether he would be believed. "Miss Lewis," he began, his voice smooth and controlled, "you claim that your supervisor threatened you during a private meeting on the evening of March 12th. Is that correct?" Marianne lifted her head. Her voice did not shake, though every nerve in her body was screaming. "Yes," she said, "that's correct." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "And you're asking this court to believe that no one else heard this alleged threat? No witnesses, no written record, nothing but your word." Her lawyer shifted beside her, but Marianne spoke before he could object. "I'm asking the court to believe the truth." A few quiet scoffs came from the gallery. The judge did not react, but Marianne noticed the way his pen paused for half a second longer than necessary. The prosecutor took a slow step forward. "Ms. Lewis, isn't it true that you were already facing disciplinary action at work at the time?" "I was," she answered. "And isn't it also true," he continued, "that a complaint like this could conveniently shift blame away from you?" Marianne felt heat rise in her chest. She had expected this, prepared for it. Still, the weight of it pressed hard. "I didn't make this up to protect myself," she said. "I came forward because what happened was wrong." The prosecutor smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Or because you knew people would sympathize with you." That did it. A murmur rippled through the room. Marianne's jaw tightened, but she did not look away. "Objection," her lawyer said sharply. "Sustained," the judge replied, though his tone carried little urgency. The prosecutor nodded, unbothered. "Let me rephrase. Ms. Lewis, do you have any proof?" Marianne inhaled slowly. This was the moment everyone seemed to be waiting for, the moment where her story would either stand or collapse. "Yes," she said. The prosecutor blinked once. "You have proof." "I do." A few heads turned. Someone in the back leaned forward. The judge looked up fully now. "Ms. Lewis," he said, "this is the first time we're hearing of any physical evidence." Marianne met his gaze. "Because until now, no one asked me to finish." Silence fell, heavier than before. Her lawyer stood. "Your Honour, with the court's permission, the defence intends to submit an audio recording relevant to the incident in question." The prosecutor's confidence faltered for the first time, just barely. "An audio recording," he repeated. "Of what, exactly?" Marianne swallowed. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. "Of the meeting," she said. "All of it." A low stir moved through the courtroom. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying her face more carefully now. Not dismissive, not skeptical, but alert. "Miss Lewis," he said, "why was this recording not disclosed earlier?" "Because," she answered quietly, "when I tried to tell people I had it, they told me it wouldn't matter, that no one would believe me anyway." Her words hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. He shuffled his papers, buying himself time. "Your Honour," he said finally, "we request to examine this recording before it's admitted into evidence." The judge nodded. Of course, but it will be heard. Marianne let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since this ordeal began, something inside her shifted. Not relief, not victory, but the quiet certainty that the truth was no longer hers alone to carry. As the bailiff moved to collect the recording device from her lawyer, Marianne glanced briefly at the gallery. The expressions she saw were no longer amused or doubtful. They were uncertain, curious, uneasy. Good, she thought, because soon they wouldn't have to decide whether to believe her. They would hear it themselves. The courtroom felt colder after the first recess, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension left behind. When everyone returned to their seats, the mood had shifted. Whispers followed the black woman as she walked back to the defense table, her posture straight, her face calm but guarded. Her name, Marianne Cole, had already been spoken with doubt, skepticism, and thinly veiled contempt. To many in the room, she was still the defendant who lied. To herself, she was simply a woman who had told the truth and was now watching it be twisted into something ugly. The prosecutor stood first, smoothing his suit jacket as though confidence could be pressed into the fabric. He spoke clearly, deliberately, repeating the same narrative he had introduced earlier. Inconsistencies, unreliable memory, emotional exaggeration. He used polished words, but the message underneath was sharp. Marianne could not be trusted. Each sentence was designed not just to argue facts, but to plant an image in the minds of the jurors. A woman desperate enough to invent a story. Marianne listened without interruption. Her hands were folded, her breathing slow. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only fed assumptions. Still, every accusation landed like a quiet blow. The prosecutor referenced her statements again, comparing timestamps, emphasizing pauses in her testimony as if silence itself were proof of deception. Then came the moment that made several jurors shift in their seats. The prosecutor claimed that during the key phone call, the one Marianne said proved her version of events, there was no independent verification of what was said. He stated plainly that it was her word against theirs, and that history showed how unreliable such claims could be. He didn't say race. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the room, familiar and heavy. Marianne's attorney rose slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't object immediately. Instead, she asked for permission to approach the bench, then changed course, addressing the court directly. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, but it carried. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense would like to introduce a piece of evidence previously submitted, but not yet played." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You mean the audio recording?" "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned. He had dismissed the recording earlier as unclear and contextless. Now he crossed his arms, visibly annoyed. The judge paused, then nodded. "Proceed." Marianne felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had listened to the recording dozens of times in private, each replay reminding her why she had refused to back down. Still, hearing it here, in this room, was different. This wasn't just about being believed anymore, it was about being heard. The clerk dimmed the lights slightly, a small speaker was activated. The courtroom went quiet in a way that felt absolute. At first, there was only static. A few jurors leaned forward, skeptical. Then a voice came through, clearer than expected. Calm, professional. It wasn't Marianne's voice, it was the voice of the man who had accused her. As the recording played, the tone of the room changed again. The voice on the audio was firm, authoritative, and unmistakable. He spoke in complete sentences, referencing dates, actions, and decisions, details that aligned exactly with Marianne's testimony. Then came the moment no one expected. A pause, a breath, and then his words, unmistakable in meaning, stripped of context, stripped of interpretation. "I know this puts you in a difficult position," the voice said, "but if you challenge this, it won't end well for you. I'm trying to help you understand that." The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. Marianne closed her eyes briefly. She didn't need to look at the jurors to know they had heard it. She didn't need to see the prosecutor's face to know his confidence had cracked. The audio continued. No shouting, no drama. Just quiet pressure, calmly applied. The kind of pressure that rarely leaves bruises, but often leaves scars. When the recording ended, the lights came back on. No one spoke for several seconds. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor cleared his throat, but didn't stand. For the first time since the trial began, Marianne felt something shift, not in her chest, but in the room itself. The story was no longer hers alone to defend. The evidence had spoken, and it did not whisper. The courtroom felt different the moment the judge ordered the audio recording to be prepared. The earlier confidence of the prosecution had thinned into something tighter, more brittle. Chairs creaked as people shifted. A few whispered conversations died mid-sentence when the bailiff called for silence. The black woman at the centre of it all, Maya, sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed forward. She had learned long ago that any visible emotion could be twisted into something ugly: anger, guilt, disrespect. The prosecutor stood again, adjusting his tie, trying to regain control of the room. He spoke quickly, as if speed could outrun doubt. He argued that even if an audio recording existed, context mattered. Voices could be edited. Words could be misunderstood. Tone could be deceptive. It was a familiar argument. One Maya had heard her entire life, in different forms. Her words questioned. Her memory challenged. Her truth treated as flexible. The judge listened without interruption, then turned slightly toward the defense table. "Play the recording," she said. The technician pressed a button. For a brief second, there was only static. Then a voice filled the courtroom. It was Maya's voice first, calm, measured, almost too polite. She was explaining herself, explaining a timeline, explaining why she had followed procedure. No raised voice, no aggression, just clarity. Then another voice entered the recording. Louder, sharper, male. "You people always have an excuse." A ripple moved through the gallery. The voice continued, dismissive and irritated, accusatory. It interrupted Maya repeatedly, cutting her off mid-sentence. At one point, the voice laughed. "Don't lie to me, I know how this works." Maya closed her eyes. Hearing it again hurt in a way she hadn't expected. In the moment it happened, she had gone numb. Now, in the silence of the courtroom, every word landed with full weight. The recording went on. The man's tone grew more hostile. He threatened consequences. He suggested she was making things up. He accused her of manipulating the situation. All while Maya stayed composed, repeating facts, asking to be heard. When the audio stopped, the silence was heavy and unmistakable. The judge leaned forward. "Is that the voice of the complainant?" she asked the prosecutor. The man hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "Yes," he said finally. "And the recording is unaltered?" "Yes." The judge nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her gaze to the man seated behind the prosecution table, the one who had pointed at Maya earlier, the one who had smirked when she was called a liar. He did not meet her eyes. The judge spoke again, her voice firm. "This court has now heard direct evidence contradicting the claim that the defendant fabricated her account. The tone, language, and conduct in this recording raise serious concerns." Maya felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, yet. Something more cautious, like the first crack of light under a door that had been locked for too long. For the first time since the trial began, she felt the room listening. Not judging, not assuming, just listening. And that, she knew, changed everything. The courtroom felt smaller than it had at any point during the trial. Not physically, nothing had changed about the rows of benches or the pale wooden walls, but emotionally, as if the air itself had tightened around everyone inside. The audio recording had already been played once, yet no one moved. No one spoke, as though the truth still hovered in the room, demanding to be acknowledged. The judge cleared his throat, but even that small sound seemed intrusive. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents before him, though it was obvious he wasn't really reading. His gaze kept drifting back to the woman standing quietly at the defense table. She had not changed her posture since the beginning of the day. Her hands were folded in front of her shoulders straight but tense, like someone who had learned long ago how to stand still while the world judged her. She didn't look victorious. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. Deeply, profoundly tired. The prosecutor was the first to speak. "Your Honor," he said, his voice noticeably less confident than it had been hours earlier. "In light of this new evidence, the state must reconsider its position." Reconsider. The word felt too small for what had just happened. The defense attorney rose slowly. "Reconsider?" he repeated, unable to hide the edge in his voice. "My client was arrested, publicly humiliated, and called a liar under oath. Her credibility was questioned not because of facts, but because of assumptions." The judge raised a hand, signaling for calm. He turned his attention to the woman. "Ms. Carter," he said gently now, no trace of the earlier skepticism left in his tone, "you have been through a great deal." She met his eyes for the first time. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but carried the weight of years. "Yes, Your Honor, I have." There was no bitterness in her words, just truth. The judge nodded slowly, then addressed the courtroom. "The audio recording clearly demonstrates that Ms. Carter's account was accurate. It also raises serious concerns about how this investigation was conducted." A murmur spread through the benches. "The court finds that the charges against Ms. Carter are dismissed, effective immediately." For a brief moment, the words didn't register. Then her attorney exhaled sharply, as if he'd been holding his breath for days. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet gasp. Ms. Carter did not cry. She simply closed her eyes for a second, as though allowing herself to feel the ground beneath her feet again. But the judge was not finished. "This court will also be referring this matter for internal review," he continued. "False assumptions, selective listening, and dismissal of testimony based on personal bias have no place in this justice system." Every eye in the room shifted toward the officers seated along the wall. One of them stared at the floor. When the session was adjourned, people began to stand, to talk, to move again, but Ms. Carter remained still. It wasn't until her attorney touched her arm that she realized it was over. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon light was muted, grey clouds hanging low. Reporters waited, microphones ready, but she shook her head politely and walked past them. She had said enough. On the steps, she paused. For the first time since the trial began, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. What hurt the most hadn't been the arrest, or even the accusations. It was the certainty with which people had decided who she was before hearing her speak. How easily her truth had been dismissed. As she walked away from the courthouse, she knew the recording had cleared her name, but it hadn't erased the experience. It had simply exposed it. And that, she realized, mattered. Because the truth had not only proven her innocence, it had forced the system, however briefly, to look at itself.